As someone who lived through the era as a teenage boy, the Vietnam War is still considered among the most controversial and polarizing conflicts in U.S. history. It was a source of harsh civil unrest, as hundreds of thousands protested the country's participation, particularly when it escalated into Cambodia in 1970. But for the soldiers who waged war against an enemy that fought it in unconventional ways, something even more unexpected and bizarre revealed itself during the conflict. And for the armed forces that witnessed it, it lent even more certainty that their overall involvement there was extremely strange. The dark and mysterious jungles of Vietnam were the backdrop for constant apprehension, with an unseen enemy hiding in wait to strike without warning and with potentially deadly consequences. The continuous dread of encounters was enough to push even the most hardened soldiers to the brink of insanity. But also lurking in those jungle regions was something else that threatened to cause grievous harm. It's been widely reported that large humanoid creatures that forces on both sides termed rock apes resented the intrusion on their territory and sought to drive out interlopers from within their borders. Sound far-fetched? Well, first consider that their presence and detriment to both the U.S. and North Vietnamese forces was so profound that a military expedition was dispatched to capture or kill them in order to eliminate their threat. During the war, U.S. troops frequently reported encountering large primates in the mountainous Central Highlands region. They were described as being somewhere around 6 feet tall and much larger than the typical apes that inhabited the country. They were said to have 5-inch fangs, walked on 2 legs, and were covered with brown or reddish-brown hair, similar in color to an orangutan, though that species had become extinct in Vietnam thousands of years earlier. In Vietnamese language, these creatures are known as Batututs, or forest people. The incidents were sometimes described as turning violent when U.S. troops would encounter these beings, who would become quite aggressive and bold when their territory became threatened by an outside presence, displaying no fear of humans. Most of these conflicts would occur at dusk or during the night, and displaying normal ape-like behavior, the creatures would travel in groups rather than alone. So many reports came in from one particular location on the Central Peninsula that it became known as Monkey Mountain. The name rock ape was given to them not because they lived in that type of terrain, but because of their penchant to throw rocks back at troops who had thrown them first, in an effort to scare them off without having to fire an actual shot and risk giving away their position. The stories of U.S. servicemen encountering these beasts are as noteworthy as they are remarkable. In 1966, on Hill 868 in the Quang Nam province, which was the site of many previous rock ape sightings, Michael Kelly's Marine unit spotted movement in the brush ahead of them. They readied themselves for battle, but were instructed not to fire unless fired upon. It was then that 8 indistinguishable forms emerged from the jungle. Believing it was the enemy approaching, the Marines literally lit up the jungle with every piece of munitions they had, which included assault rifles and grenade launchers. Kelly, who was at the far end of the clearing, picked up his weapon and rushed to lay down fire with his platoon sergeant. As they peered over the top of a fallen tree they were using for cover, expecting to see a significant enemy force, they instead saw hundreds of 5-foot-tall creatures skirting among the trees. A large male rushed the soldiers with fangs bared. According to Kelly, the rock apes barked similar to dogs the entire time. When the creatures eventually retreated, the soldiers explored the battle scene expecting to find bodies littering the landscape, yet none were found, nor were any traces of blood. Kelly wrote,
"This may sound very strange to you, but although I had no or little concern about killing the enemy, killing innocent animals turned my stomach and could really enrage me if done without being a necessity. But I searched the site and found not one drop of blood, which totally amazed me given the amount of firing that had gone on. I wonder to this day if the men were shooting just to scare the rock apes away or whether they were really just poor marksmen. The men who'd suffered the surprise looked a bit worse for wear, and I'm sure a few had to wash their shorts out as a result of the unwelcome visit. It really scared the crap out of them. I kid you not.
This skirmish would become known as the Battle of Dong Den. Alfonso Villarreal was serving with Company M, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, when he was flown to Da Nang, Vietnam in 1967. A Purple Heart recipient, the story he told on his 73rd birthday in 2017 is as compelling as it is bizarre. He was with his platoon at nighttime, when off in the distance the men saw what appeared to be something like a large medicine ball rolling toward them through a ravine. Eventually it came to a stop at the end of one of their rifles, whose possessor tapped on the object. The ball then unfolded into a small creature that began screaming and waving its arms before it quickly ran off. Villarreal immediately knew it was a baby rock ape. Then came the boulders rolling down the ravine, some weighing as much as 300 to 400 pounds. They were being thrown by adults, who then started down the path toward the platoon with malicious intentions. Villarreal said there was no choice but to shoot at them, estimated at 17 in all. "I've never seen anything like it," he said. The next report is from the diary of Robert Jungle Vet Baird, who wrote on the Vietnam Veterans homepage,
"The next day and nights blurred together, but we did have a hard downpour just before sunset, which cooled things down a bit. At night, we started hearing noises at the edges of the barbed wire. Could be rats, might be VC. Pancho, a Mexican-American corporal who was with me in the defense bunker, decided to walk up to the communications bunker at the top of the hill. Off he went, and I visually followed him as far as I could see. Then I was alone, on top of a mountain in a foreign land. An eternity seemed to pass before I saw movement on the trail and recognized Pancho coming back. About 100 feet from the bunker, he stopped and bent over slightly, seeming to look at something. All of a sudden, his M16 cracked off a small burst of fire, and he ran like hell back to the bunker. The lieutenant was already calling on the radio, wanting to know who the hell is shooting at what down there. Pancho was laughing so hard that I got on the radio and told the lieutenant that it was me and that I thought I had heard something outside the wire. The lieutenant chewed a piece of my ass out, then he got off the radio. When Pancho got control of himself, he told me that he had been walking back to the bunker when he noticed a bush that hadn't been there before. He bent over to see it better, and it snorted at him. That's when he fired. What he had encountered was the ubiquitous rock ape of Vietnam. I would come to learn that they were nearly everywhere, and quite fearless. That is what we had heard near the wire that night.
During a 1969 patrol, American soldiers were surprised by the Viet Cong and were pinned down. The unit pressed themselves into the mud to avoid being struck by aggressive fire. At one point, one of the soldiers watched a figure emerge from the undergrowth, which he at first assumed was a tall and very well-built enemy soldier. But its true identity was revealed when it ventured into the flashes of crossfire, being hit several times in the process, stumbling, but never falling, as it ran away from the skirmish. The soldier then heard the VC yelling to each other before retreating in panic. As the wary U.S. soldiers approached the now abandoned position, they saw that one of the enemy had left his weapon as he fled. As they set up camp, the sound of inhuman howls penetrated the night. A accompanied by whining, barking, and growls from somewhere deeper in the jungle. The following morning, as they ventured out to investigate, they came upon the body of a Viet Cong soldier who had been torn limb from limb, and they fled from the gruesome scene in terror. One soldier who witnessed the carnage said,
"The rest of the time we were in Vietnam, I never heard the sounds or saw anything like it again. The talk of what we had seen spread very quickly, and some of the locals called it a name that I can neither pronounce or remember. But the translation, if I recall, was stench monkey or foul monkey, something like that. I can't remember for sure. What I do know is that it bothered me so much that I transferred from there to a job on a helicopter so that I wouldn't have to be in the jungle anymore."
Dr. John McKinnon had studied Vietnam's fauna for decades and had discovered a great number of species of large mammal that were previously unclassified. In his 1978 book, In Search of the Red Ape, it was revealed that in 1970 he had discovered a number of odd footprints on his journeys. He claimed they displayed human-like toes and were about the size of an Asiatic black bear, which is native to Southeastern Asian countries, including Vietnam. When he asked local people about the tracks and what might have produced them, they told him stories of the Batutut, which they claimed stood around 5 feet tall, with matted red fur covering most of its body, an aggressive nature, and had no fear of humans, with all of those characteristics matching what was reported by the U.S. soldiers who had previously encountered them. After hostilities ended in 1973, the Vietnamese government ordered an expedition to be led by General Hoang Minh Tha in an effort to capture or kill one of these creatures, but the mission failed to produce a body either way. Professor Vo Quai from the Vietnam National University was also sent on an expedition to find definitive proof of the Batutut. While one was not spotted, he also discovered unusual prints which he was able to cast. And while the footprints were larger than any known species of apes, they were deemed too wide to be human. Now, the reports of this creature that came from everyone that included locals to soldiers on both sides of the conflict certainly suggest that such a creature likely did exist. But there are also alternative theories put forth as to what may have been seen and perhaps even why. So in the interest of being fair and balanced, let's present those to you right now. There are also stories of these creatures coming out of the jungle and displaying quite docile behavior, even casually taking a seat next to the locals. But these stories could be exaggerated or fictionalized after the rock ape came into the public consciousness. While the Batutut has long been a part of Vietnamese folklore, we should remain suspicious of tales romanticizing them. The aforementioned orangutan would certainly fit the bill, but it bears repeating that while they indeed did inhabit Vietnam for a time, their eventual extinction from the country eliminates them as a suspect. Today they're found on only 2 islands, Sumatra and Borneo. Another possible candidate for misidentification would be the northern white-cheeked gibbon, a native of Vietnam. They do exist in large social groups and spend much of their lives in the trees, but they don't come close to being 5 feet tall with a muscular frame. The average gibbon is perhaps 3 feet tall and weighs around 20 pounds. But the possibility that a soldier, already wary of the rock ape's existence, could conceivably mistake a gibbon for one at a quick glance remains at the very least plausible. One of the widely prevailing theories surrounds the psychological state of the soldiers, fighting in a combination of harsh, sweltering conditions against an unconventional enemy that redefined the term jungle warfare. Vietnam was a place where many who went off to fight came home with a part of them left behind, both physically and psychologically, and were never whole again. These conditions and the constant fear of possible ambush via guerrilla tactics that lurked around every hill or manner of foliage could easily raise havoc on the human psyche, and hallucinations, mass hysteria, and the constant fear of the unknown can easily erode a rational person's judgment and basic senses. In a high-stress environment, once a shot is fired at an unknown target, no questions are asked before others follow suit. But we should temper that by respecting the idea that these servicemen can tell the difference at 15 feet between a human and a hairy primate. It is also rare that more than one person hallucinates the same thing. Finally, drug use cannot be totally ignored as a factor in the sightings. It's well known that marijuana use was common among soldiers serving in Southeast Asia, and while paranoia can be a residual effect and would heighten already existing anxiety, hallucinations are a normal result of its use. In terms of use of psychedelics such as LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin mushrooms, 31% of soldiers claim to partake in them, with an additional 28% using harder drugs such as cocaine and heroin. It's further been revealed that the armed forces used 225 million tablets of stimulants between 1966 and 1969. In addition to those amphetamines, which were used to boost endurance on long missions, sedatives were prescribed to help relieve anxiety and prevent mental breakdowns. A cocktail of these drugs can certainly result in a distorted view of reality. The question would then be, can we assume that every encounter was drug or stress-induced, and we can simply write them off based on only those possibilities? Now, with all these alternate theories, it should be noted that enemy forces also encountered these primates in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and stories of their existence were well known prior to the war. One man recalled his father being in Vietnam with his Marine troop in 1967 and having to surrender his grenades in certain areas so they weren't even tempted to throw them. When the grenades were returned, his father, a bit confused, asked why, and the older guy said that the rock apes would throw them back at them, so no grenades were allowed in these areas. And it wasn't just a prank played on the newbie, because this procedure was common in future missions. United States Army Sergeant Craig Jorgensen wrote a book titled Strange But True Stories of the Vietnam War that included an eyewitness account of the creature. And as a veteran of the war, we'll let a passage from that book close this story.
It was a hot day. The 6 men from the 101st Airborne Division were taking a break in the middle of a mountainous jungle when the event took place. They had been carrying 100 pounds of equipment under the unforgiving sun in a mosquito-infested environment, full of unfamiliar sounds and views that were nothing like the American soldiers were used to in their native land. Despite the momentary resting time, they kept their 5 senses on, for they were aware that the Viet Cong could have very well tracked them, something the natives were exceedingly good at. Suddenly, according to the men, a few small trees located 15 yards uphill began clearly shaking. The soldiers had trained for this, and as they got ready for combat to fight the expected VC soldiers jumping out of the bushes, they never imagined what they saw next. A long cucumber-shaped head showed up. The face, the soldiers said, was covered in red hair with a pair of dark eyes and a huge mouth. The creature then stepped out of the vegetation into a clearing, allowing the group to observe the rest of its muscular body, which was also featured by the same type of red hair. It wasn't taller than 5 feet and walked upright. It stopped and looked at them as though it was scrutinizing each of the soldiers. "What the hell is that?" one of the soldiers recalls muttering. "It's an orangutan, isn't it?" asked another. "Well, if it is, he's lost, because there ain't no orangutans in Vietnam."